In this video, we're going to be talking about assessment, which is discussed in your books in Chapter 10. So we already looked at this graphic from the National Council of Teacher of Mathematics principles, their fifth principle on assessment and their purposes for assessment. And I think you guys have already talked about this in your assessment class in the College of Ed, but just how assessment is so much bigger than just let's give a test and let's put a grade in the grade book. That's part of assessment, but it is by no means all of assessment. So let's kind of explore that a little bit further today. All right, there are two basic types of assessment, formal assessment and informal assessment. Your formal assessment is probably the thing you're going to take up in grade. It's a quiz, it's a test, it's a project, but it's something that you're going to take and you're going to grade, and something's going to go in the grade book from this particular assessment. Most of the assessment we do on a day-to-day basis is going to be informal assessment. Before the formal assessment comes, you need to have done a ton of informal assessment so that you can see and get a good feel for what your students do and do not understand. And then if you look back, part of the purpose of that assessment is promoting growth in your students and improving your own instruction. So as you are doing that informal assessment, if you notice that, wow, none of my students really understood what I said about exponents, then that's something you need to go back and talk about again before you get to the formal assessment. I have heard it said in the past, and this is somewhat true, somewhat not true, but I have heard it said that the grades you see on a formal assessment should not be a surprise to you. You should have done enough informal assessment that formal assessment, oh yeah, that's kind of what I expected to see from this student or this group of students or whatever. But spend a lot of time on that informal assessment, using it to inform your instruction and how you need to make changes before that formal assessment comes around for your students. That informal assessment can also be used to help students know what kind of changes they need to make. So if you give like a practice quiz one day and they realize, wow, not doing my homework for the last 4 nights has really caused some problems. Well, before they get to the formal assessment, hopefully they're going to realize they need to make some changes. So it can be used both for students to make changes, for teachers to make changes. It can be used to uncover some hidden misunderstandings the student has. There's just a lot of positives from doing a lot of that informal assessment. So from the lesson plan rubric and the lesson teaching rubric, this is how I'm going to grade you guys on your lesson plans and your mini lessons, but I just copied this off of there. So within the course of the lesson that you're going to teach, or what you have planned to teach, not necessarily in the 15 minutes you're going to teach, but from what you have planned, there should be a good bit of formative assessment. Every day you're checking on your students. What do you know? What do you not know? What do we need to talk about again? What do I need to go back and help you understand a little bit more deeply? From the 15 minutes that you're going to be teaching, that's what this teaching rubric is for. Somewhere in that 15 minutes, you need to verify that your students demonstrate conceptual understanding. Remember, that's the why and the how. And also verify that your students demonstrate procedural fluency. Can they actually do it? So I've got students in quote marks right here because the students that are going to be sitting in front of you are actually your classmates. And we all know that each of us can handle middle level mathematics, but basically pretending that you are teaching sixth, seventh, or eighth graders, whatever grade level you happen to choose, have you verified that those pretend middle school students sitting in front of you are understanding the whys? Did you ask some questions to help you figure out what they do and do not understand as far as their underlying knowledge? And did you check at some point during the lesson, can you actually do what I'm asking you to do? Can you actually add the fractions? Can you actually distribute with the exponent? You know, whatever it is that you want them to do, that's what you need to be checking for your students. And just as an aside, please take some time to go back and read carefully through both of those rubrics before you present your lesson to the class in a couple weeks. Okay, so one thing it said in NCTM is that assessment should focus on understanding as well as procedural skills. So they're saying not only should you be doing procedural fluency, but you should have conceptual understanding as well. Exactly the same things that I'm asking for in class, exactly the same things that EdTPA is going to ask for. They all, like everybody agrees that these are the things that math students ought to be able to do. So you had the perimeter example in your text on page 282 and 283. And here's another similar example of something that I have done in my Algebra 2 class, something I did in my college algebra class here at Winthrop when I used to teach that. So there is a section in both of those classes, a fairly large section on graphing. So I can ask my students, graph this polynomial. Obviously, if they have their calculator sitting in front of them, that's a no-brainer. And even if I ask them to identify the roots, or I ask them how many turning points, they can type it in their calculator, and the calculator can answer those questions for them. On the other hand, if I draw a graph and I ask them questions about this graph that I'm not giving them an equation for, that opens up everything. Now, all of a sudden, they have to have truly understood what a turning point is, or how the turning point helps you know what the degree is, or how the end behavior helps you know what the degree is. All of those things that I could ask in a straightforward way, I'm now asking in sort of a backwards way to assess my students' understanding. This doesn't really assess their procedural skills, it more assesses their understanding. And I went through and looked at the process standards. Look at all those process standards. By switching the way I ask the question, I am asking for information and testing their ability on the process standards, not just the content standards. So I think that's very important, and it really helps our students move forward on firmer footing if they understand the hows and the whys, and you have forced them to articulate that in some way. So as you're thinking about a straightforward question and a not straightforward question, I know that's in one of the reading questions. A straightforward question is still like, it could be just solve this equation. It could be a word problem where they have to come up with their own equation, but that's still basically just a solve this equation in a word problem context. It's still a straightforward question. This would be an example of a less straightforward question, or of excuse me, a more alternative type question where they cannot get to the answer directly unless they truly have that understanding of what we have been talking about in class. Okay, so let's look at a sixth grade standard. That was a high school college example. Let's look at a sixth grade example and see what we can come up with. So I picked a sixth grade standard. You guys remember sixth grade, if you're on grade level, sixth grade is the first time we really start learning about positive and negative numbers. We don't necessarily do anything with them as far as arithmetic in sixth grade, but sixth grade is when we have our eyes open to the fact that these negative numbers actually exist and that they have value and meaning. So let's look at assessing our students, both for conceptual understanding and for procedural fluency, and we're going to look at those formally and also informally. Okay, so a formal question for conceptual understanding. I'm going to give them a number line. I'm going to put a closed-in dot on the point -6, and then I'm going to ask them to create a word situation that would be graphed using the graph that I gave them. So that's going to ask them, do you understand what -6 is? Do you understand why negative numbers exist? I could also add in there to have them give me an explanation of what 0 would represent in that particular situation. But that would be, because it's a quiz question, it's something I'm going to grade, I'm going to put that in their formal assessment. All right, now if I talk about informally, now this is 2 days before the quiz and I'm talking to my students and we are providing numbers given a situation. So if I give you some words, can you give me a number? And we're also going the opposite way. Given a situation, given a number, can you tell me a situation that might go with it? And we're going to talk about how there's lots of correct answers to that. That's often mind-boggling in math, that there's lots of correct answers, not just one. Students are going to explain not just what their answer is, but how they know their answer is correct. So that's how I'm testing them for understanding. All right, formally for procedural fluency. Basically, can you graph a negative number if I give you one? Do you know where that is on the number line? Okay, that's this. And I'm not saying that these types of questions, these understanding questions, are better than these fluency questions. That's not true. What I'm saying is both of them are important. Your students need to be able to do both of those things. And I think a lot of times as math teachers, we focus more of our attention here and forget about the importance of this. All right, an informal one. Maybe we're going to go outside and I'm going to draw a huge number line on the sidewalk beside the basketball goals. That's what we had at Saluda Trail. Y'all probably have something similar. And I'm going to say, Johnny, you go stand on -6. Josephine, you go stand on +5. Carlos, you go stand on 0. And can they do that? Can they put themselves on that given number? And that's an informal way of assessing their procedural fluency. Okay, another thing that's really important is reliability and validity. And I think you have probably heard a student say in the past or been a student that said in the past, oh my gosh, I can't believe that question was on the test. We've never done anything like that before. So here is where we're going to talk about this. So reliability. Basically, if you give multiple versions of the test to a student, will they score roughly the same thing on all of them? If the answer to that question is yes, then you have created a reliable assessment. You're likely to get the same score over and over and over again. So how can you ensure that your assessment is reliable? Well, I generally give 2 versions of my test, partially to help keep eyes on the own paper. You could also do this if you're going to have a makeup test ready for those students who are absent. Some of my students believe that test days are good days not to be at school, and so I need an assessment prepared for when they return. So what I always do is I take both tests myself ahead of time and ensure that they have the same difficulty level. If one of them has an improper fraction, does the other one have an improper fraction? If one of them has a division by a negative, does the other one have division by a negative? It doesn't necessarily have to be on the same problem, but within the particular type of question, have I covered each one? All right, validity is a little bit different. Validity is, does that test measure what you intend for it to measure? The things that I taught in class, is that actually what's on my test, or did I put some wacko question on there that's going to throw my students for a loop because I never actually did anything like that? Well, a way to solve that problem is to create the assessment before creating your lesson. I know with my videos in my Algebra 3 class this semester, I'm going into Delta Math and I'm creating their homework assignment, and then I'm going and creating my video to help them do that homework assignment. So hang on a second. Isn't that just teaching to the test? Isn't that what we're not supposed to do? Okay, so teaching to the test is not that in any way. Teaching to the test would be like your standardized test coming at the end of the year. Suppose you know that one particular thing is going to be on the test and one particular thing is not, but both of them are in the standards. If you choose to focus on the thing that is on the test and ignore the thing that is not on the test, that is cheating, is teaching to the test. That is poor teaching because you're not really teaching all the standards you're supposed to. You're picking and choosing so that your students will do well on that test, not so that they will be able to move forward well. What's happening here is that you are deciding ahead of time, I need to make sure I put one that gets a square root answer on the test. I need to make sure I have one where they have to simplify the fraction on the test. And so therefore, if I'm going to ask them to simplify the fraction on the test, I need to have them simplifying the fraction in our work during class. I can't put something on the test that is of a different difficulty level or a different type of problem than anything I have done in class or anything they have seen in their homework. In order to ensure that I don't do that, I'm going to create the test first. And then I can verify that everything I think is important, everything that's in those standards I'm supposed to teach, I have covered in class. And then there's no surprises when the test comes around. The students, they may think it's a surprise. You may still get that comment, but there is really no basis for it because you have carefully selected your lessons to support that test that you know is coming.